Hello and welcome. My name is Alan. I'm a bit late getting to this, but we're finally starting, as I said we would, reading the Bhagavad Gita. Now, the actual book, the Bhagavad Gita, is a part of Hinduism as far as religion. Blurb on the back reads, the Bhagavad Gita, also known as the Song of the Lord, is the best known of all the Indian scriptures. And Eknath Eswaran's reliable, readable version has consistently been the best-selling translation. The introduction places the Gita in its historical setting and brings out the universality and timelessness of its teachings. Chapter introductions give clear explanations of key concepts, and notes and glossary explain Sanskrit terms. The Bhagavad Gita opens dramatically on a battlefield as the warrior Arjuna turns in anguish to his spiritual guide Sri Krishna for answers to the fundamental questions of life. But as Ayaswaran points out, the Gita is not what it seems. It's not a dialogue between two mythical figures at the dawn of Indian history. The battlefield is a perfect backdrop, but the Gita's subject is the war within, the struggle for self-mastery that every human being must wage to live a life that is meaningful, fulfilling, and worthwhile. So yeah, I've not read the Gita. I just know a little bit about it. Not much at all. And of course, the most famous is Oppenheimer's "I have become death, destroyer of worlds." That famous line. But yeah. Let's see. On the vast plains of North India, a timeless spiritual classic was born. The message of Sri Krishna to Prince Arjuna on the brink of a war that he doesn't want to fight. Arjuna's struggle is the Bhagavad Gita. In the Bhagavad Gita is acutely modern, but has lost his way on the battlefield of life and turns to find a path again by asking direct, uncompromising questions of his spiritual guide, Sri Krishna, the Lord himself. Krishna replies in 700 verses of sublime instruction on living and dying, loving and working, and the nature of the soul. So yeah. So, again, I know nothing but names, this and that, of Hinduism, not read any of the texts, that including the Bhagavad Gita. But what we'll do is we will go ahead and jump in here and read the foreword and probably the introduction. Well, I was going to say introduction, but it's quite a long one. Goodness. My goodness. He writes quite the introduction. Do, 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 do. Tell me, goodness, sir. Yeah, that's 67 pages of introduction. We'll do the foreword. It's rather short. Anyway, the classics of Indian spirituality. Imagine a vast hall in Anglo-Saxon England not long after the passing of King Arthur. It is the dead of winter, and a fierce snowstorm rages outside, but a great fire fills the space within the hall with warmth and light. Now and then a sparrow darts in for refuge from the winter or weather. It appears as if from nowhere, flits about joyfully in the light, and then disappears again. And where it comes from and where it goes next in that stormy darkness, we do not know. Our lives are like that, suggests an old story in Bede's medieval history of England. We spend our days in the familiar world of our five senses, but what lies beyond that, if anything, we have no idea. Those sparrows are hints of something more outside. A vast world, perhaps waiting to be explored. But most of us are happy to stay where we are. We may even be a bit afraid to venture into the unknown. What would be the point, we ask? Why should we leave the world we know? Yet there are always a few who are not content to spend their lives indoors. Simply knowing there is something unknown beyond their reach makes them acutely restless. They have to see what lies outside, if only, as George Mallory said of Everest, because it's there. This is true of adventures of every kind, but especially of those who seek to explore not mountains or jungles, but consciousness itself, whose real drive, we might say, is not so much to know the unknown as to know the knower. Such men and women can be found in every age and every culture. While the rest of us stay put, they quietly slip out to see what lies beyond. Then, so far as they can tell, they disappear. We have no idea where they have gone. We can't even imagine. But every now and then, like friends who have run off to some exotic land, they send back reports. Breathless messages describing fantastic adventures, rambling letters about the world beyond ordinary experience, urgent telegrams begging us to come and see. Look at this view. Isn't it breathtaking? Wish you could see this. Wish you were here. The works on this set of translations, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Dhammapada, are among the earliest and most universal messages like these, sent to inform us that there is more to life than everyday experience of our senses. The Upanishads are the oldest, so varied that we feel some become collectors. Some unknown collectors must have tossed into a jumble all the photos, postcards, and letters from this world that they could find without any regard for source or circumstance. Thrown together like this, they form a kind of ecstatic slideshow, snapshots of towering peaks of consciousness taken at various times by different observers and dispatched with just the barest kinds of explanation. But those who have traveled those heights will recognize the views. Oh yes, that's Everest from the northwest. Must be late spring. And here we're south in the full snows of winter. The Dhammapada, too, is a collection, traditionally sayings of the Buddha, one of the very greatest of these explorers of consciousness. It is the case, in this case, the messages have been sorted, but not by scheme, not by a scheme that makes sense to us today. Instead of being grouped by theme or topic, they are gathered according to some dominant characteristic, like a symbol or metaphor. Flowers, birds, a river, the sky. That makes them easy to commit to memory. If the Upanishads are like slides, the Dhammapada seems more like a field guide. This is lore picked up by someone who knows every step of the way through these strange lands. He can't take us there, he explains, but he can show us the way. Tell us what to look for, warn about missteps, advise us about detours, tell us what to avoid. Most important, he urges us that it is our destiny as human beings to make this journey ourselves. Everything else is secondary. And the third of these classics, the Bhagavad Gita, gives us a map and guidebook. It gives a systematic overview of the territory, shows various approaches to the summit and their benefits and pitfalls, offers recommendations, tells us that what to pack and what to leave behind. More than either of the others, it gives us a sense of a personal guide. It asks and answers the questions that you or I might ask. Questions not about philosophy or mysticism, but about how to live effectively in a world of challenge and change. Of these three, it is the Gita that has been my own personal guidebook, just as it was Mahatma Gandhi's. These three texts are very personal records of a landscape that is both real and universal. Their voices, passionately human, speak directly to you and me. They describe the topography of consciousness itself, which belongs as much to us today as these largely anonymous seers thousands of years ago. If the landscape seems dark in the light of sense perception, they tell us it has an illumination of its own. And once our eyes adjust to we can see in what Western mystics call this divine dark and verify their descriptions for ourselves. And this world, they insist, is where we belong. This wider field of consciousness is our native land. We are not cabin dwellers born to a life cramped and confined. We are meant to explore, to seek, to push the limits of our potential as human beings. The world of the senses is just a base camp. We are meant to be as much at home in consciousness as in the world of physical reality. This is a message that thrills men and women of every age and culture. It is for such kindred spirits that these texts were originally composed, and it is for them in our own time that I undertook these translations in the conviction that they deserve an audience today as much as ever. If these books speak to even a handful of such readers, they will have served their purpose. Introduction to the Bhagavad Gita. Many years ago, when I was still a graduate student, I traveled by train from central India to Simla, when the summer seat of the British government, then the summer seat of the British government in India. We had been long out of Delhi when suddenly a chattering of voices disturbed my reverie. I asked the man next to me if something had happened. Kurukshetra, he replied. The next stop is Kurukshetra. I could understand the excitement. Kurukshetra, the field of the Kurus, is the setting of the climactic battle of the Mahabharata, the vastest epic in any world literature, on which virtually every Hindu child in India is raised. Its characters, removed in time by some 3,000 years, are as familiar to us as our relatives. The temper of the story is utterly contemporary. I can imagine it unfolding in the nuclear age as easily as in the dawn of Indian history. The Mahabharata is literature at its greatest. In fact, it has been called a literature in itself, comparable in its breadth and depth and characterization to the whole Greek literature or Shakespeare. But what makes it unique is that embedded in this literary masterpiece is one of the finest mystical documents the world has seen, the Bhagavad Gita. I must have heard the Gita recited thousands of times when I was growing up, but I don't suppose it had any special significance for me then. Not until I went to college and met Mahatma Gandhi did I begin to understand why nothing in the long, rich stretch of Indian culture has had a wider appeal, not only within India, but outside as well. Today, after more than 30 years of devoted study, I would not hesitate to call it India's most important gift to the world. The Gita has been translated into every major language and perhaps 100 times into English alone. Commentaries on it are said to be more numerous than on any other scripture. Like the Sermon on the Mount, it has an immediacy that sweeps away time, place, and circumstance. Addressed to everyone of whatever background or status, the Gita distills the loftiest truths of India's ancient wisdom into simple, memorable poetry that haunts the mind and informs the affairs of everyday life. Everyone in our car got down from the train to wander for a few minutes on the now peaceful field. Thousands of years ago, this was Armageddon. The air rang with the conch horns and shouts of battle for 18 days. Great phalanxes shaped like eagles and fish in the crescent moon surged back and forth in search of victory until the end, when almost every warrior in the land lay slain. Imagine, my companion said to me in awe, Bhishma and Drona commanded their armies here. Arjuna rode here with Sri Krishna himself as his charioteer. Where you're standing now, who knows? Arjuna might have sat, his bow and arrows on the ground, while Krishna gave him the words, the Bhagavad Gita. The thought was thrilling. I felt the way Schliemann must have when he finally reached the desolate bluff of western Turkey and knew he was standing on the ringing plains of windy Troy, walking on the same ground as Achilles, Odysseus, Hector, and Helen. Yet at the same time I felt he knew the setting of the Gita much more intimately than I could ever know this peaceful field. The battlefield is a perfect backdrop, but the Gita's subject is the war within, the struggle for self-mastery that every human being must wage if he or she is to emerge from life victorious. The Gita in its setting. Historians surmise that, like the Iliad, the Mahabharata might well be based on actual events culminating in a war that took place somewhere around 1000 BC. Close, that is, to the very dawn of recorded Indian history. This guess has been supported by excavations at the ancient city of Dvaraka, which, according to the Mahabharata, was destroyed and submerged in the sea after the departure of its divine ruler, Krishna. Only 500 years or so before this, by generally accepted guess, Aryan tribes, originally from the area between the Caspian Sea and the Hindu Kush Mountains, had migrated into the Indian subcontinent, bringing the prototypes of the Sanskrit language and countless elements of belief and culture that have been part of the Hindu translation ever since. The oldest part of the most ancient of Hindu scriptures, the Rig Veda, dates from this period, about 1500 BC, if not earlier. Yet the wellspring of Indian religious faith, I believe, can be traced to a much earlier epoch, when the Aryans entered the Indian subcontinent. Through the mountains of the Hindu Kush, they encountered a civilization on the banks of the Indus River that archaeologists date back as far as 3000 BC, roughly contemporaneous with the pyramid builders on the Nile. These Indus dwellers achieved a comparable level of technology. They had metalworkers skilled in sheet making, riveting, and casting of copper and bronze, crafts and industries, and standardized methods of production. Land and sea trade and cultures as far away as Mesopotamia, and well-planned cities with water supply and public sanitation systems unequaled until the Romans. Evidence suggests that they may have used a decimal system of measurement, but most remarkable, images of Shiva as Yogeshvara, the Lord of Yoga, suggest that meditation was practiced in a civilization which flourished a millennium before the Vedas are committed to an oral tradition. If this is so, it would imply that the same systematic attitude of the Indus Valley dwellers applied to their technology was applied also to the study of the mind. This was Brahma Vidya, the supreme science. Supreme because where other sciences studied the external world, Brahma Vidya sought knowledge of an underlying reality which would inform all other studies and activities. Whatever its origins, in the early part of the first millennium BC, we find clearly stated both the methods and the discoveries of Brahmavidya with its introspective tool and inspired rishis, literally seers, of ancient India analyzed their awareness of human experience to see if there was anything in it that was absolute. Their findings can be summarized in 3 statements, which Aldous Huxley, following Leibniz, has called the perennial philosophy because they appear in every age and civilization. 1. There is an infinite, changeless reality beneath the world of change. 2. This same reality lies at the core of every human personality. 3. The purpose of life is to discover this reality experientially. That is, to realize God while here on earth. These principles and the interior experiments for realizing them were taught systematically in forest academies or ashrams, a tradition which continues unbroken after some 3,000 years. The discoveries of Brahmavidya were systematically committed to memory and eventually to writing in the Upanishads, visionary documents that are the earliest and purest statement of the perennial philosophy. How many of these precious records once existed, no one knows. A dozen that date from Vedic times have survived as part of the Hindu canon of authority. The 4 Vedas all have one unmistakable hallmark: the vivid stamp of personal mystical experience. These are records of direct encounter with the divine. Tradition calls them Shruti, literally heard, as opposed to learned. They are their own authority. By convention, only the Vedas, including the Upanishads, are considered Shruti, based on direct knowledge of God. According to this definition, all other Indian scriptures, including the Gita, are secondary, dependent on the higher authority of the Vedas. However, there is a conventional distinction, and one that might disguise the nature of the documents it classifies. In the literal sense, the Gita too is Shruti, owing its authority not to other scriptures, but to the fact that it is set down the direct mystical experience of a single author. Shankara, a towering mystic of the 9th century A.D., whose word carries the authority of Augustine, Eckhart, and Aquinas all in one, must have felt this, for in selecting the minimum sources of Hinduism, he passed over almost 100 Upanishads of Vedic authority to choose 10 central Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. The Gita, I would argue, is not an integral part of Mahabharata, but is essentially an Upanishad, and my conjecture is that it is set down by an inspired seer, traditionally Vyasa, and inserted into the epic at the appropriate place. Other elements were added in this way to the Mahabharata and to other popular secondary scriptures. It is an effective way of preserving new material in an oral tradition. There is also traditional weight behind this idea, for as far back as anyone can trace, each chapter of the Gita has ended with the same formula. In the Bhagavad Gita Upanishad, the text on the supreme science, Brahmavidya of Yoga, this is the chapter entitled. Finally, by way of further support, we can observe that except for its first chapter, which sets the stage, the Gita not only does not develop the action of Mahabharata, but is rather at odds with it. Battle lines are drawn, the climax of decades of dissension. And on the eve of combat, Prince Arjuna loses his nerve and asks his charioteer, Krishna, what to do. Then what? Krishna, no ordinary charioteer, but an incarnation of God, enters into some 700 verses of sublime instruction on the nature of the soul and its relation to God, the levels of consciousness and reality, the makeup of the phenomenal world, and so on, culminating in a stupendous mystical experience in which he reveals himself to Arjuna as the transcendent Lord of life and death. He counsels Arjuna to be compassionate to friend and enemy alike, to see himself in every person, to suffer other sorrows as his own. Then the Gita is over. The narration picks up again, and the battle is joined. A terrible, desperate slaughter, compromising everyone's honor, by the end of which Arjuna's side emerges victorious. But almost every man of fighting age on both sides has been slain. Only great genius would have placed the Gita in such a dramatic setting. But it stands out from the rest as a timeless practical manual for daily living. To those who take this dramatic setting as part of the spiritual instruction and get entangled in the question of the Gita justifying war, Gandhi has a practical answer. Just base your life on the Gita sincerely and systematically, and see if you find killing or even hurting others compatible with its teachings. He makes the same point of the Sermon on the Mount. Every heart of the Gita's message is to see the Lord in every creature and act accordingly, and the scripture is full of verses to spell out what this means. I am ever present to those who have realized me in every creature, seeing all life as my manifestation. They are never separated from me. They worship me in the hearts of all, and all their actions proceed from me. Wherever they may live, they abide in me. When a person responds to the joys and sorrows of others as if they were his own, he has attained the highest state of spiritual union. The one I love, who is incapable of ill will, who is friendly and compassionate. They alone see truly, who see the Lord the same in every creature, who see the deathless in the hearts of all that die. Seeing the same Lord everywhere, they do not harm themselves or others. Thus, they attain the supreme goal. Scholars can debate the point forever, but when the Gita is practiced, I think it becomes clear that the struggle the Gita is concerned with is the struggle for self-mastery. It is Vyasa's genius to take the whole great Mahabharata epic and see it as metaphor for the perennial war between the forces of light and the forces of darkness in every human heart. Arjuna and Krishna are then no longer merely characters in a literary masterpiece. Arjuna becomes every man, asking the Lord himself, Sri Krishna, the perennial questions about life and death, not as a philosopher, but as the quintessential man of action. Thus read, the Gita is not an external dialogue, but an internal one between the ordinary human personality, full of questions about the meaning of life and our deepest self, which is divine. There is, in fact, no other way to read the Gita and grasp it as spiritual instruction. If I could offer only one key to understanding this divine dialogue, it would be to remember that it takes place in the depths of consciousness, and that Krishna is not some external being, human or superhuman, but the spark of divinity that lies at the core of the human personality. This is not literary or philosophical conjecture. Krishna says as much to Arjuna over and over. I am the self in the heart of every creature, Arjuna, and the beginning, middle, and end of their existence. In such statements, the Gita distills the essence of the Upanishads not piecemeal but comprehensively, offering their lofty insights as a manual not of philosophy but of everyday human activity. A handbook of the perennial philosophy unique in world history. We'll go ahead and end this episode there. We've still got a good portion of the introduction to read. So that may take another 2-3 episodes. But we'll read through that, and then we'll get into the actual Gita itself. But yeah, we have been given a little background by the author, translator of the text here, Mr. Ashwaran. Now, again, there's a lot to Hinduism. There's multiple texts. Think of them as the multiple books of the Bible. They work kind of in that fashion. Yeah. You have all the Upanishads, the Vedas, which are also called the Shruti. So, we're getting a good base and back lesson of Hinduism, which some of these other texts are something I might read at another time. But yeah, like I said, in this series, we are starting with just the Bhagavad Gita, which is the conversation between Sri Krishna and Arjuna, who is one of the great heroes of Hinduism. Hindu mythology. Now, as the author pointed out, there is a chance, yeah, there was some big battle before the rise of our modern Indian civilization in the Indus Valley. You know, you're taught, well, I was taught back in school, there's four main civilizations that began along, great rivers. You had Egypt along the Nile, India along the Indus River, Mesopotamia along what were the name of those two rivers? Poof, they're gone. I know it's two rivers that meet together. I cannot remember the name of them. You can look it up if you want. And of course, in China, along the Yellow River. But yeah. So they say that there's proof there was some huge battles before that point. So it may be similar to the way much of the Trojan War is not just mythology, but is history. That's, a great battle took place in these fields. It's not necessarily to say there are gods that really were at either one, but yeah, there were events that took place that we can match up. Yeah. Anyway, that'll be it for now. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.